All right, you guys, welcome back to another episode of the Rebranded Athlete Podcast. I'm always excited for guests, but today I'm definitely excited for our guest, Adam Lewis. And he and I spoke on a panel oh my goodness, I think it was a couple of months ago now with Tackle What's Next. And I was so impressed by the work that he does that I really wanted to have him here on the show. He has a wealth of knowledge for you guys. And again, being a former athlete and the work that he does right now, I think it's really going to hit home. So I want to tell you a little bit about him before I officially introduce him. So Adam is focused on using play and sport to drive social justice and address the greatest challenges facing our communities. He serves as an advisory board member to the Portland, Oregon Parks and Recreation Bureau and a community giving officer creating economic equity across Oregon. And prior to that, he served as the managing director of Street Soccer USA Portland, which is a nonprofit that he funded. He led the social impact legacy strategy for INEOS and the World Athletics Championships OR22 and was a fellow at the New Leaders Council. And on top of that, he's a community advocate. He's talked about play and empathy at TEDx, very impressive. Presented on the power of play and politics at the 2022 NLC Convention. And he was the 2019 Portland Timbers Community MVP Award winner and has been featured in the Washington Post and USA Today. So without further ado, Adam, welcome to the Rebranded Athlete Podcast. Thanks for coming on today. How are you doing?
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Sarah. And we are live, is that right?
We are live right now. So we are streaming into Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, and people are able to catch replays as well too. So we may have some people pop in. And like I tell you guys all the time too, if you're here live with us, the beauty about having a live podcast is you guys can actually interact with us and ask questions. And it's more than just being a fly on the wall. You actually get to be part of the conversation too. So don't forget, if you guys are listening on those live platforms right now, to go ahead and engage in the conversation, and we'll definitely answer your questions as we go along. So yeah, so soccer, already a connection. My husband is a soccer player as well too, so definitely have a love for that. But if you could tell us a little bit about your background, maybe how you got into soccer, who you played for, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird to think about an activity as kind of like a defining characteristic of your life. But that, I mean, over the past, 20, 25 years, that has been the focal point of my life. It's how I made friends. It's how I grew into myself as a person. And it really provided me with something that was so far outside of the game. I mean, I had a coach who once told me, you're not going to remember any of the games that you play in, but you're going to remember the memories of goofing off with your teammates and the moments when you struggled and
Right.
so it's funny the things that I've sort of held on to about being an athlete. And my journey took me to some really interesting places and has really not necessarily directly, but very indirectly has opened a lot of doors for me. I had this incredible privilege as a youth athlete to play all over the state of Oregon, travel to tournaments all over the country. My parents have certainly never let me forget that they were driving me, 2 hours, to every practice when I was 12 years old. I'm certainly grateful for that time with them, but certainly want to mention that I was very lucky to have that opportunity in my upbringing, and then played at 2 different Division III colleges. Really use sport to get what I think is a great education, and now can't give it up. I'm still playing men's league, and am being way too competitive, but yeah, it's been a huge defining characteristic of my life.
Yeah, it's that inner athlete, it's so hard because it is ingrained in us, and I don't know about you, when you started, I was about 8 years old, and it's like that's all I ever knew
Yeah.
my whole life. And then to not be able to have it or find different ways, because it is different once you are on that competitive level and then you go to, like pickup games or, different rec leagues and stuff. It's sometimes cannot be as fulfilling, but you still have, that that drive in you, that competitiveness. And I
Right.
think that's the beauty of being an athlete, is that we can find how we can transfer that into something else. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I was a very like sort of small child, I was a big time late bloomer. And so being able to find, a game and somewhere where I could compete where like my height wasn't everything
Mm,
was,
right.
it's ironic because, I sprouted up in high school. But it was one of those things where, growing up and being smaller than everyone else, it gave me a distinct sense of identity and taught me how to compete.
Hmm. Yeah, and it really does. And even starting at that age, and thinking that you're not going to, however big you're going to get, like physically, it's such a surprise. And I think even for myself, like I remember distinctly in middle school, like seventh grade, not being the greatest at my sport, but then all of a sudden it's like when it clicks, when your body type, like the training, like everything finally comes together, and you're like, oh my goodness, like this is it. Like I really enjoy what I'm doing, and you just keep striving for more.
Oh, totally. Totally.
Yeah, that's
And
so
it's always that piece of, and I think, this is a trend in especially sports in the US, is the emphasis on winning regardless of what age you're at, and not necessarily on like developing athletes.
Mhm.
And,
Right.
it's funny, a lot of I guess they're not my favorite coaches, but the most impactful coaches in my life are the ones that cut me,
Hmm.
are the ones that
Yeah,
said that you weren't good enough or you weren't big enough or you weren't strong enough.
right,
And it, creates this persona now and this ability to sort of lean into different things with a sense of resiliency and grit. And that knowing that if
right,
somebody says, eh, you know, you're not good enough for this or you're not the right fit, that you can still approach the things that you're passionate about with vigor. And I think that, yeah, sports taught me that.
right. Yeah, that resiliency piece, and even overcoming, I think, challenges throughout the games, and what we're taught. And I think we are fortunate to have our area, or our, arena to do that, and have that be our practice ground for life skills. Like we were fortunate to get to do it through sports,
Right.
instead of having later on, to not have those experiences, and have those hard lessons come at us, and not really have something to relate it to. And it's like, oh yeah, I remember that feeling. I felt the same way when I got
Yeah.
cut from that team, or I didn't make, the starting position, or whatever it was. We have something to relate to. Yeah.
Right. It's that feeling. I love the way you phrase that. It's that feeling of being there before,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
Um, I've always felt that it was interesting where like, soccer game is 90 minutes long. If somebody fouls you or says something that you don't like or gets under your skin, that's maybe 15 seconds of a 90-minute game.
Right.
And so, I've always sort of looked at that as like, why let that define, your experience in a field, whether you're, you know, in a, changing jobs or you're, just having a bad day and somebody says something to you, like, why let that define your outlook on the bigger picture? And, yeah, it's definitely that resiliency piece I've taken with me.
Yeah, it's a huge life lesson for all of us
Yeah.
to learn early
Yeah,
on, which
yeah.
is great. Yep. Great part about being an athlete, and being able to have access to that. Yeah. So after college, was there any aspirations to go pro or take it any further?
I think like every kid and every college athlete, of course, if I had the
Yeah.
opportunity to, I think part of it was that I was absolutely made of glass. I could never stay healthy. Um,
Oh man.
yeah, yeah. Had knee injuries, couple of concussions, and had to make this decision where it was like,
Yeah.
do I want to put my body and my sort of psyche through this, knowing that playing for a first division team in any country wasn't really a reality.
Mm-hmm.
Was that I had a ceiling in this, and that's really hard to come to grips with.
Oh yeah,
That's something that I had,
absolutely.
based my identity off of for all of these years. You realize isn't going to happen. And I think a lot of that, you can kind of mask that by diving into other activities. Um, and I think I tried to distract myself from the fact that I was letting go of something that was so important to me for so long. And that manifested itself in healthy ways, like studies and different clubs and getting involved in social activism, but also manifested itself in negative ways. You look for any distraction, and frankly, the most readily available distraction on a college campus is partying.
Yeah.
And so, I think it's something that, for all of us that were in that environment can empathize with. And so my sort of 2 cents on that is to just like really recognize if you're indulging in something because it's a distraction or if it's just something you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, again, it took me a lot of distractions to figure out uh, sort of like what was going to be my calling after sport, and it's a really difficult transition.
Yeah, it's definitely a huge, huge difficult time, and I think especially for us athletes too, like trying to navigate that sense of identity, and especially being young too. Young people are more prone to attach themselves to an identity a lot faster because maybe they haven't had, different experiences. And I think you made a great point, especially being on a college campus and how easily it is to become part of that culture, of
Mhm.
partying and being distracted in that sense. And I'm sure, a lot of athletes listening right now, who went to college can, definitely, empathize with that too. Even myself, like, same thing for me. Like I resorted to that because at the time it seemed to be like a numbing, technique
Yeah.
for me. And I was really not wanting to deal with the fact that, I was moving on to this next chapter of my life, leaving my sport behind, but really what was next for me. And what I've learned in that process too, it's like that same feeling like will continue to happen in your life anytime that there's a transition, and not just
Right.
out of sport, right? If there's a career change, if there's like a, something in your family or life in general. And it's really about how we react and respond. And I think our transition out has given us, a good taste of it, of what it's
Right.
like. And for a lot of us, we don't want to go back to how we were during that time without the support that, is out there now.
Oh,
Mhm.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and how about for you, like that identity loss? Like how did you navigate that during your transition out of sports?
Um, I think the most important piece for me was recognizing that everything I was feeling was part of the process. That I feel like if I had walked into something immediately after I had, sort of kept one foot in, one foot out of sport, um, I think if I had fallen into something, I wouldn't have learned really important lessons. And so, like, recognizing that when you're having a really tough day, when you're feeling lost, that isn't it's not unique to you, but it's also part of the process.
Mhm.
To this is funny that this is the only, quote that's coming to mind, but it's actually a 50 Cent lyric where he says, joy wouldn't feel so good if it wasn't for pain. It's right. Like the
Right.
hard days make the good ones feel good. And so like feeling lost and not knowing where you're going next is normal and part of the process. And that was the biggest learning curve for me, was
Right.
that like my support system from friends and from family was really, kind of incredible and something I'm really grateful for. But the biggest learning curve and I think where I showed the most progress in building that transition was in the personal work I was doing.
Mhm. And what kind of personal work were you doing at the time, like to help with that?
Um, I mean, I frankly, I should have been, seeking therapy a lot earlier than I did. I'm
Mm,
a firm believer in that, like having a neutral sounding board is really important. I think the other thing was like recognizing that I didn't have to go all into everything all of the time,
yes, that's so hard.
right? We're as athletes, you're always sort of taught to be a maximalist.
Yep.
You know, if you're not if you're not training someone else's, that's what coaches
Right.
would always say. And in life, that is, to a certain extent true, but it's also not sustainable.
Hmm.
And so like finding time to relax and finding different things that interest you and trying them and being okay with, maybe this wasn't for me.
Right.
I don't, my first, full-time gig out of college was doing marketing and demand generation for a technology company. And, I ended up there because an alumni from my school kind of wrote me into it. But, I had worked there for like 3 months and was like, "This isn't for me."
Hmm.
And, but every other sort of, societal pressure is saying, "Stay in the job. This is your
Yep.
career. Keep working towards it."
Don't quit.
Exactly, right? Yeah,
Like
yeah,
that don't
see
yeah,
that?
like we don't quit mentality. Yeah, and it's,
Right.
I like it's a blessing and a curse. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? Like being an athlete, like we have these skills and we have this drive and we have this mindset that's like incredible really when you think about it, but how much is too much sometimes, and
Right,
especially when we're out of our sports, because it really like it can push you into the direction you need to go, but at what cost, like sometimes is it burnout, is it losing relationships, like different things, because
right.
we don't know when to cut it off, because our coaches always said like keep going.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, so interesting. Yeah. It's so interesting to hear because, you think that, like even for myself, like I feel I'm the only one that feels that way. And that's what
Mhm.
I love about this podcast too, is that there's so many athletes, like we all have the same set of values and, different things. Like a lot of us have a lot of very similar things that we got because of our sports, and has really
Right.
turned us and shaped us into the people that we
Yeah.
are today.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And so since we're talking a little bit about like life lessons, what do you think is maybe a huge life lesson that you learned from soccer that has carried over to your life today?
Good question. I think the biggest lesson that I learned, we touched on this a little bit before, is that feeling of, you know, being there before, is
Mhm.
having that rubric to build up resiliency. I've been, screamed at by coaches on the sidelines. I've played in terrible games. I've, missed penalty kicks, that would have won the game.
Yeah.
So I've had all of these, in addition to successes. Like my entire soccer career wasn't, me just getting yelled at. But
Right.
um like the point is that, you know, it gave me the opportunity to fail so much that now in life, when it happens, it really can become a learning experience. Like that doesn't mean that I'm not, like sad if I don't get an opportunity that I wanted, or, if I, really fail at a project at work, or whatever it is. But it's this feeling of like not allowing that to define my, entire existence, but also not allowing it to define my day even.
Right. Yeah. I love that. And it's you're so spot on with it too, because we have so many opportunities to fail and come back
Mhm,
from it, and it kind
mhm.
of goes back to what I mentioned earlier about like our sport allows us to have, that practice time. It's like a playground. I
Yeah,
know
yeah,
we're going to get into play,
yeah,
but
yeah, go
yeah,
figure. Yeah.
yeah, it's definitely, a really a safe space when you think about it. Even though at the time as an athlete, if you, and even just putting it soccer terms, really, like if you miss that penalty, like that in your mind at that moment is probably like the worst thing that could happen to you at that time. But then as you move on from it, you find, the lessons to be learned from it, and you come back again with that resilience piece. Because people, who go through things in their lives, some people just give up. And I think that's
Yeah.
also with athletes, like, we don't give up, like, we find a way. And in life after sports, it's more about finding the resources and trying different things, because we've only known like our bubble, right? Like, I
Yeah.
only knew the volleyball world and how we deal with things that way, and not really seeking or reaching to resources and people who can help us like through challenging times too. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So I definitely want to dive into the work that you do right now. So I know you talk a lot about social impact, but maybe you could define that a little bit for some of our listeners who maybe don't know what it is, and, talk a little bit about the work that you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So that definition piece, I think is really important, and I think it's sort of focused on two things: is driving justice and equity throughout
Absolutely.
communities. And so when we talk about social impact, it's sort of become this catch-all for like anything sort of quote unquote positive
Mm-hmm.
in the world. And I think the two things that I've really focused on in my work is this creating justice for communities that I'm working with, or creating justice in terms of addressing a specific problem, and is this equitable, or is the outcome going to be equitable? And I think, throughout my work, I've tried to approach this, whatever challenge it might be, whether it's climate change, racial injustice, mass incarceration, homelessness, whatever it might be. I've tried to approach this with play at the forefront, and really trying to ask this question of, what is the role of these silly little games that we like to play with each other in
Mm-hmm.
creating a more just world? And it's really been this sort of driving thread throughout my work.
Yeah. And when I think of play too, especially with athletics, like, it's such a universal language. Like, when you think
Mhm.
about it, right? Like, we can be in any country, different things, like for soccer, for example, right? Like, we have the World Cup going on right now, like all these different countries who are coming together that are, playing a sport. But um beyond the field, I think that's, and I'm sure we're going to jump into this a little bit more too, but like how we then figure out maybe different avenues or different ways to play like as athletes, just besides our sport. And I think even for myself, like, I never really gave myself an opportunity to try new things, because one, I didn't ever want to get hurt with something else, like a different
Right.
activity or sport,
Yeah.
because that's like the worst thing. You got to go and tell your coach that, you can't play in the game because you did something else. And
Right.
two, just really not being exposed to anything else. Because really, when you're within your own sport, like, all I knew was volleyball, and that's all I was really exposed to. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And it's interesting that you bring up the World Cup. I'm an avid soccer fan, and have, sorry to the folks that I'm working with, but I have had, a little corner of my screen with the World Cup most days. Um,
Yeah.
but I think what this has really shown us, perhaps in a more polarizing example than ever before, is that sports are inherently political.
Very
You
much.
know,
Mhm.
I think that if you remember, geez, this was a few years ago now, the right-wing pundit Laura Ingraham telling LeBron to shut up and dribble, you know,
Mm.
that
Mhm.
that doesn't exist.
Right.
Um, and I think, again, this is yet another example where we're seeing on a global stage these like incredibly complex geopolitics sort of intersect in a sporting field. And that is not only fascinating and wildly important, but and this is, I'm going to sound like a broken record, because I've said this for years throughout my career, is that like we have to reimagine why we play and what the games are.
Mm.
And I think one thing that perhaps unseen, that we love about sports is, and in games in general, everything from you and I putting on pads and a helmet and playing in the Super Bowl, to playing rock, paper, scissors to see who takes out the trash later. They're right. So
Right.
it's very much so all inclusive, but games are moments when we have an opportunity to learn what justice and equity and equality and all of these values that we think healthy, thriving societies are built on. We have a chance to learn them. And the more we do it, the better we get at it everywhere else. And so for me, it's like these massive sporting events force us to take pause.
Mhm.
Whether you're a soccer fan or not, news about the World Cup is unavoidable.
Oh, yeah. It's everywhere.
It's everywhere. And so you kind of have to take pause to look at it. And in those, it's an interesting thing to number one, be an athlete, but number two is be a fan. And,
Mhm.
you know, s- sports, movies, church, and school are, one of the four things where we all sit still and look the same direction. Kind of this like
Yeah,
cathartic
that
moment.
yeah, man, just, like, had a visual with that right now, but it's so true. It's so true, like, undivided
Like,
attention, right?
yeah. And
Yeah.
so if we put so much, stake into watching sports, into being a part of them, into the, multi-million dollar industries that they're frankly multi-billion dollar industries that they are, um, why have we made it so hard for just people to play in their day to day?
Mhm.
You know,
Right.
the I'm sure, I shouldn't say most folks that are way too obsessed with sports know this, but for sort of the general audience is like, um, after you turn, I want to say it's like 12, your opportunities to play sports, especially for free, are cut in half.
Mhm.
And then as you get older, every part of your daily life says, I'm too busy. I don't have enough money. I don't have enough time. I don't have enough energy to play. And that's because the older and older you get, the more society has said this isn't a part of adult life. And I don't
Mm.
understand why.
Right. Yeah. And why when we turn that magic number of 18, right? Like if you're not part of competitive sports, like why is it not okay to still continue to play? Like and even in
Right.
the workforce, right? Corporations and stuff. And I think that's so cool that there are different companies and organizations that really focus around play to bring
Right.
out the creativity, because that's where it comes from when we allow ourselves to, express ourselves, in different situations and different games. Like that's where the ideas come from.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
It's that personal creativity. Excuse me. It's that personal creativity. And it's also that, like I said, that learning moment is that the more that
Mhm.
we have opportunities to play, the better we get at creating healthy
Right.
communities everywhere else.
Right. Right. And it brings that sense of community,
Yeah.
like within it. And so I think I told you, but I was a school principal before doing
Mhm.
Rebranded Athlete. And one of the things that I really focused on at the two school sites I worked on was really building up that school culture. And I focus on athletics, obviously, because of my background and I know what it
Yeah.
brings. But I worked at a few school sites, one in particular where we had a lot of behavior issues. It was the socioeconomic status, the neighborhood, just, there was a lot of things that were out of kids' control on the street. And really they didn't have the opportunity to quote unquote like belong to something. So we developed a really good athletic program, and we started to see the behavior issues decrease, the
Mhm.
academics increase, and it just became more of a prideful thing for the kids to want to be part of the school and want to be part of something, because they had an outlet, to be able to play and to be part of a team. And imagine if we would be able to do that more in just like these few organizations that do this, in the real world, right? Like after we all graduate college or whatnot, and go on to, our professions. But if we had more opportunities within our communities, I think you're right. Like I think things would be changing. There would be more of a sense of community. Hmm.
Oh, absolutely. And I so appreciate and love that you shared that story, because it's one of those experiences that certainly isn't in isolation.
Right.
Like, I don't think you're going to talk to another school principal that's going to say, no, sports are bad. We want fewer opportunities for our kids, right? And
Right.
so, sort of just like as a society, as a culture, it's sort of become this, you know, that like play is universally a good thing. Like, no one is going to be like, no, we don't want that.
Right.
But yet all of the systems as you get older and older are structured to not allow you to do that.
Right.
And I think that like, some of the sort of, you know, sort of opinions of folks that maybe haven't played very much in their life, or they haven't been a part of teams, and they can't really see the value. They'll say, I can't see why we would invest money in play to address homelessness or climate change, or student outcomes, in terms of education, social
Mhm.
emotional learning skills. And the fact is that like sport and play alone aren't going to be the sole answer to addressing these massive issues,
Right.
but they're an inseparable part of it, because they're an inseparable part of our lives.
Mhm.
It's one of the first things that we quote unquote learn how to do. Although you don't have to teach a baby to hit a rattle in front of it, it just does it.
Mhm.
And so like
Mhm.
why are we devaluing, and why are we trying at every juncture to rip out a sense of what makes us human and what makes
Mhm.
us want to enjoy each other? Um,
Right.
anyway, I'm sorry, I'm projecting. I could talk about this stuff
No,
forever.
no, no, it's great. No, and just like expression, and I think
Right.
that's also what it comes with. And even, if it's not play in a sport, like other ways too, through the arts, through music, through different avenues, I think that people can, lend themselves to be creative. And again, I think it goes back to that connective piece. And I think as athletes, even for myself, like having been on a team for so long, like I still in my life like strive for that, because
Yeah.
it's just like my sense of belonging, and I know that I can be myself and be creative, as long as I'm surrounded by my team.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. So, wow. And then like, so let's talk a little bit about like the athletes of today, like even the athletes
Mhm.
that are competing, whether it's collegiate or professional. How do you think that, they can help use their platform today, maybe to, improve our communities or give inspiration maybe to people to play?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's a great question, and I'll kind of point to two different potential avenues, and want to
Mhm.
be like pretty pragmatic with this.
Yeah.
You know, I love the theoretical stuff and the big sort of cultural shift that we talked about earlier, but I think that if you are an athlete, is recognizing where you have the most influence.
Hmm.
Not all of us have 100 million, Instagram followers, and can, post
Right.
something that suddenly, is going to make this massive societal change. You might have the ear of a teacher or a mentor in your community, or you might have a group, a team of younger people that look up to you if you're still, a youth athlete, where you can start to get them to listen and start to get them to pay attention to issues that are impacting your community.
Hmm.
And so number one is definitely like be very critical with what your sphere of influence is and who you can convince to make a positive change. And the second piece, I would say, and this is a very, very cheesy quote, but it's, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go
Hmm.
together.
Great
I'm
quote.
a firm, yeah, right. Like I'm a firm believer in the necessity to have teammates
Hmm.
in whatever you're going to do. And I think a great example of what I mean by that is, uh, after the murder of George Floyd, there was an NBA playoff game in the bubble between the Milwaukee Bucks and the Orlando Magic, where the Bucks refused to come out of the locker room.
Hmm.
They're saying, we're taking a stand, And a lot of folks looked at that media moment and they said, the Bucks are boycotting, this is a boycott of the NBA, but it wasn't that at all. This was a
Right.
strike,
Mm-hmm.
that this was an example of incredible collective action. And as soon as the Bucks announced it, the Magic joined and said, we're not accepting your forfeit. Like, no, we're going to
Mm-hmm.
replay the game and we're going to force everybody to reschedule it. And that was such an incredible moment where very high profile athletes use their power in a collaborative way.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I think there's sort of this interesting caveat that I want to bring up, that it's not always up to the athletes to have to do this. We have this fascination, especially in the US, where we always want our athletes to tell us what to do. And, like all of us, we're born into this system
Mm-hmm.
and we created it so we can change it. But we also have to think about, like, what's the best way to do that.
Right.
And for me, it's always been, number one, figure out who your sphere of influence is. And number two is build power, build coalitions, build
Mm-hmm.
collaboration.
Yeah, there's power in numbers,
Oh, yeah.
and I think especially there's so much that a team can do,
Yeah.
and going back to your quote too, like there is some, like we can only do so much by ourselves, but it really does take that collective agreement between people. And I think definitely using the platforms in space, for positivity. And
Right.
I think we're at such a turning point right now, especially with collegiate athletics as well,
Yeah.
that you and I didn't have the opportunity to, really have NIL and have,
Mhm.
be able to use our names, our brands, and become a personal brand and really take a stance on things. And I think right now with NIL, that's where a lot of the confusion is with some athletes is, they're just taking on, any type of brand or,
Yeah.
sponsorship and not really thinking about what do I value myself, my core values, who do I stand for, and what do I want to be known to stand up with, you
Yeah.
know? Yeah.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, that NIL piece is interesting. I mean, I played D3. I'm not sure if anybody wanted to sponsor me.
Yeah.
I don't think that would have happened. I played D3 in two very small towns. Um, but I do think that it's very much so a new reality.
Mhm.
And there's this sort of um, like interesting moment for athletes where some of them are trying to monetize, and rightfully so, monetize their most marketable years,
Mhm.
right? Like I don't think that we should be taking away that opportunity from them. And I think, should potentially find a way to get them, a more stable income.
Mhm.
But that's certainly a conversation for another time. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that an NIL has definitely opened the doors for folks to have more of a voice.
Mhm.
And I hope that we continue to see this trend of especially high profile athletes using that for positive social change, and recognizing that their platform gives them this incredible privilege to influence lots of people.
Yeah. Yeah. And something I say a lot, and that I've said in the last couple of years, like athletes have the ability to change the world. And
Yeah.
I fully believe that, because not only of now, especially like the influence that we can have on people, but the skill set that we've talked about today, the
Mhm.
transition piece of that, like taking that skill set that we have as athletes and turning it into something else, and I think that's what play also allows us to do, is to find different things that we are good at or things that we enjoy.
Mhm.
Because if we didn't allow for that to happen, then we get stuck in jobs and situations that don't serve us, and that's what's happened to a lot of athletes because they haven't been able to find play outside of
Yeah.
their sport.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, it's so fascinating. So, where do you see yourself going with the work with this? Like, what are you up to now? And is there a way for people to connect with you or join in on this?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So I am all over the place. in terms of like what I'm working on, with that through line always being focused around play.
Hmm.
And that really, sort of manifests itself in different ways. My really sort of big project this year was working with INEOS, who is a sponsor of the World Athletics Championships, and figuring out like what legacy social impact looks like. So you bring a massive sporting event to a community, and like what happens to the kids and the people that actually live there.
Mm.
And am right now, working with the Portland Parks and Recreation Bureau to create, everything from more equitable systems to, addressing key challenges that the Bureau in the city is facing of like, how can you create a frankly, a playful city.
Mm. I love that. Yeah.
And so, in terms of like where this is going to take me, I'm not really sure. And I think that that's kind of an incredible place to be.
Hmm.
Um, but I'm really sort of being mindful about like where I want my time and my energy to go. And, sort of just like we were talking about with those NIL sponsorships, is, trying to be really, really mindful with where I'm associating my
Hmm.
voice and my energy and all of those other things to create an impact, while, always keeping play at the center.
Yeah. I think that's so needed. And for you guys listening out there, definitely keeping play at the forefront, because it opens up so many opportunities. And I really don't see the negative behind, playing and being competitive and using it in that positive manner, especially being an athlete and having a platform and being able to drive change in a positive direction. But I think, there can be a fine line, because some people can drive it to the negative side, but keeping it towards that positive end and knowing that, there's different ways that you can have an impact. And when some people think of that, they think it has to be such like a global thing, right? Like I have to do
Yeah.
something huge. And no, it's like, start within your community. Like, how can we make our current communities where we live better? And if people just focused on their community, how much better would the world be?
Yeah. It's that sphere of influence.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're coming very full circle.
Yeah, full circle with it, man. Well, I have one final question for you before we wrap up that
Mhm.
I ask all my guests. So, what's something surprising that you've learned about yourself since you left the game?
Oh, wow. That is a great question. I think something that I realized, and this sounds really, really kind of weird, but I love being bad at things. And what I mean by that is, I had played the same sport, since I was 4 or 5 years old. And at a certain point, if you're a competitive athlete, you sort of have this competency in the sport that like you just sort of associate has always been there. And you sort of forget about, oh, like I had to learn how to pass the ball, and like, learn how to shoot, and learn, how to, be in all of these different positions all over the field. And I think that I had forgotten about that.
Mm.
And one thing, it's funny, there's a surfboard behind me, and I picked up surfing during the pandemic with the intention of like, I've heard this is the hardest thing, hardest sport to do. I want to be really bad at it, but like I still want it to, be physical. And so I think the thing that I learned is that with the right approach, being bad at something is really fun,
Hmm.
because you
Love
can
that.
let go of that necessity to like need to be the best, and need to, always be competitive, and learn to enjoy things. So I think that's the biggest thing I learned.
I love that. And I love that you took up surfing. Like that's so amazing. I tried it when I was in high school and was not very good. I got up like
It's
once
so
on it.
hard.
It
Yeah.
is a very, very hard sport.
Yeah.
But that's the beauty in it, right? Like trying new things. And I'm sure there's going to be other things that you try in your life, that aren't even on your radar right now. And I think that's, like we talked about today, like really just being open to drive change and have different possibilities. And yeah, I just really amazing work you're doing, Adam. And I think, it's not talked about enough. And I think that this is definitely something that is going to continue to change people's lives and the communities that we live in, and ultimately raise the vibration of the world, one play at a time.
I hope so. And I might borrow that motto.
Yeah.
That's
One
good.
play at a time. It's all yours, Adam.
Right.
Awesome. Well, where could our listeners get in touch with you if they want to reach out and connect?
I do mean this very seriously. You should absolutely reach out, even if it's just like a conversation to learn more. If you're interested in my background, if you want to, it's all welcome. My website is adam-lewis.co. It turns out there's a lot of Adam Lewises in the world that have all taken all the good domain names. You can also find me on LinkedIn just by searching my name. And I'm doing a little bit of a social media cleanse right now. You can follow me on Instagram at Adam Isidore. And I promise that I will be back online at some point.
Cleanse is good.
Yeah, it's important. But other than that, feel free to reach out. And Dr. Sarah, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. And I'll definitely make sure we put all the contact information in the show notes. But no, thank you, Adam, really, for coming and, shining some light, especially for athletes. And again, like your story, I think relates to so many other athletes about finding themselves in the transition in life after sports, and really the great work that we can do beyond the game. And that's what it's all about, is finding what we're good at next and finding the next season in our life. And for you, it's all about play, which is great.
Oh, yeah.
Love it. Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in to the podcast today. Remember to follow us on Instagram at Rebranded Athlete. Also on YouTube, you can subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and catch us live each week on Wednesday. So I will catch you guys next time. Take care. Have a great day.